Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about watercolor techniques. So come join in, and if you want to actually join in, you need watercolor paper. You can have some tape. I literally am just going to use some super cheap Prang watercolors. You need a cup of water, you need some salt, and then I have this lovely stuff called liquid frisket, which is super fun, but the cheaper version of it that you can use is rubber cement. I have some various brushes and some paper towel. And we're going to listen to some classical music that is it's no longer copyrighted. So that way our sound doesn't get out. I'm also dressed like this because I want to support teachers today. So if you have a cool teacher story to share about like your favorite teacher and how they inspired you, I'd love to hear it. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to tape down your piece here. And the reason that you tape it down is because this keeps it from warping. Why, hello. Thank you, Scaredy Fox. How are you doing this morning? So, I like to use this type of tape just because it's a little easier to take off of your paper once it's done. But another tip is to try and get your tape not so, man, this music is very dire. To get it not so sticky, you just put it on your pants and get it a little bit roughened. So that way it doesn't stick to your paper so much. Hi, Scaredy. All right. So next we're going to use my pencil. And I do this with my students every year, and it's always so fun. And I don't know, it's really nice to learn a bunch of different techniques. I have misplaced my my rubbing alcohol because there's a really cool technique. I think I probably brought it to school. So if you're like me and misplace everything all the time, and you're like thinking about like, oh, where did I put my my ruler? Just use another piece of paper. Hi, Sherry. Come watercolor with me. I'm just doing a little tutorial, you know, gonna record it and then put it up on the YouTubes. All right. So yeah, this is my cheapo way of when I don't have a ruler nearby, I just use a piece of paper. I don't know how many of you do that because, yeah, I never know where my ruler is. So, hello. So, my idea for this stream is also to try and support teachers. So, if you have a good story about a teacher, like one of your favorite teachers, please share your story about a teacher in the comments. I'll do my wash here. So we're listening to some classical music here. Because I was like, I need something that's not copyrighted. So hey, classical music's not copyrighted. Like, because it's, you know, Creative Commons stuff. Alright. So, when you're doing a wet wash, you're going to want to get your brush really wet, and I like to wet my paper first, and this is why you tape your paper down, because then it's not going to warp as much. It still might warp a little bit. Alright, and if you're cheapo like me, and especially like my students, we use these lovely palettes. When you're doing a palette like this, I always teach my students, dip, drop, dip, drop, dip, drop. And the reason that you do that is you activate your paints. So then you gently pet it like it's a cat. You don't squish your paintbrush down like crazy. And then there's the palette right here to get it all mixed. And the reason that you wet it down first is because then you can get a nice clean thing and you don't show up paint strokes. If you want it to be more of a gradient, you just add water. So, teachers, favorite teachers of all of your life. Oh yes, good music for it. I'll share the first teacher that really cared. When I was in first grade, I was not a good student in terms of I was just really doing poorly. I couldn't read. I was kind of ADD-ish, just kind of jumping around, loved dancing and singing. And most teachers would probably just go she's just a problem and she'll never learn. But my teacher, Mrs. S, was super awesome. And she was just super kind with everything that she ended up doing. She ended up realizing that I was struggling a lot with learning to read. So she actually would take time to teach me to read on her, during her plan and stuff. And she learned that it was easier for me to learn to read by singing it. And so she actually taught me how to read by singing vowels and stuff like that. And it's those types of teachers that make a big difference in your life. So if you have a teacher story that about a teacher who just was you know, a big influence on your life, please let me know in the comments. Comments that way. So, yeah, share, and I will share it aloud. All right. So that's a wet wash with a little bit of a gradient. So now I'll do the wet on wet technique. So again, you want to wetten your entire paper section. Okay, and the reason I teach this one as differently is because I think it ends up being pretty cool if you do a different technique here. So I'll do purple. Is that purple? Yeah, that's purple. All right, so remember, dip, drop, dip, drop. Get your paint activated. And the lovely thing about watercolor is that it goes, a little bit goes a long way. You don't need to overuse it. All right, so when you're changing colors, always remember to wash out your brush. That's what this here's for. All right. Let's see if it'll do it. So while your paint is still wet, you can actually drop colors into it and it spreads. Which can create a really fun texture. I love watercolors because they do a lot of unexpected things. How fun. All right, for my dry brush technique, I'll probably do something a little different. I'll use my fan brush because fan brushes are so nice. And yeah, so you can use your fan brush to do a lot of different techniques. So I think that dry brush and fan brush go pretty much together because you can, you know, make some texture like grass. All right, so I'm gonna get a color. I'm gonna make a color over here. I should have cleaned out my palette here sooner. All right, so, oops. I'm gonna make a color that's a little bit more natural grass-like by mixing my green and yellow. Sometimes it's also nice to neutralize your colors by adding a little bit of the complementary color. So the complementary color of green is red, and since we've added yellow to it, it's more of a yellow-green at this point. So what I can add is a red-orange, so I'll add a little bit of orange to it. And that can create kind of a more natural grassy color. I think I need a little more green in there. It's important when you have like a very limited color palette to be able to mix colors. All right. So the importance with dry brush is to actually have a dry brush. But what I do oftentimes is I get my brush a little bit wet so that I can have that like separation if I'm trying to get some good texture, and I always end up picking up my paint and then drying it off a little bit on my paper towel. Okay. And my brush is still not dry enough. It's harder to do with watercolors, and I'm not like the best at watercolors. I just have been doing it for a really long time, so it's like the thing I'm the most familiar with. Oftentimes you want to layer colors. Yeah, this is not very dry. Still. This is more like a wet on, yeah. There. Oh, there we go. Is that better? Is it? Yeah, okay. There we go. Thank you, Shay. Yeah, I used a little too much water in my dry brush technique. So I might let that dry and try and do some dry brush over that to do some fun dry brush stuff. All right, salts. So like, I love the wet on wet technique because it does this kind of thing, spreads and has this like really natural texture to it. And when you use salts, it also does some really really cool things where, because it's salt, it sort of sucks up all of your moisture. So you always want to start with a wet technique. So you always add water to it first. And like, kids oftentimes struggle a lot with how wet a like watercolor needs to be. So they also struggle with putting the paintbrush in their palette. They always stick it in there and like, so I always end up telling them just to pet the paint. All right, I'm gonna go back to blue because I like making my salt technique with blue and make it look salty. Salty! The other thing when you're doing a salt technique is you do want to use a decent amount of pigment, or else it's just not going to show up. And then the other thing that you have to remember is you have to do this while it's still wet, and once it's wet, here we go. Once it's dry, this technique won't work. So you usually just pick some salt up and sort of spread it around. Boop, boop, boop. All right, so you can see that it's like soaking up certain areas. If you are not happy with how the salt is looking, then you can do a few things. You can add a little bit of a different color and kind of do this technique on top of the salt, and it creates an interesting texture. But be really careful not to move your salt around, because if you move your salt, then it ruins the technique. So what I sometimes do, if I'm not like loving my salt technique, is I'll get a little bit of the wet on wet technique on top of there and add a little bit to it. So you can see what a difference these two techniques look like right next to each other. Because and you won't be able to really tell what happens until later. So, all right. Now, these two are going to have to dry for a little bit, but I need to, whoop, there we go. So I'm gonna do Frisket and rubber cement. So with Frisket, it's this lovely stuff. You want to use something that you don't care too much about, because Frisket is going to ruin your paintbrushes. So what I sometimes do is I sometimes use a toothpick, or if I don't have a toothpick lying around, I'll sometimes use like the back of a paintbrush that's cheap. Plus then I can take the Frisket off. The reason why you use Frisket is that it keeps things that you want left white. And it smells lovely. All right. So let's just, the nice thing about Frisket versus rubber cement is that it's a lot more like thin, so you can do a lot more with it. Like, you have to think in the negative though when you're doing it. And if you have a paintbrush like me, this is my Frisket brush. So it's already had Frisket on it. So and if you do it in a thinner layer, it'll dry faster, so it won't like take so long to dry. Why, hello, Endolin. Oops. I've just frisketed myself. Oops. Yeah, feel free to follow along. I should probably, where is my, alright. So Frisket is the more like artsy tool to use it. But for those who don't frequent a art store that often, and you end up just wanting to get something else that will keep your paper white, is, I should open this before, is rubber cement. You have to be careful about this one, because, you know, it's rubber cement. It stinks. Hold on, I have to use my X-Acto knife. I feel like I'm in a Looney Tunes here with this music. It's great. Watch as Birdie just totally ends up cutting herself. No. Stool, be the right way. Thank you. Is it still recording? Oh. All right. So rubber cement. If you have like brand new rubber cement, it's not gonna smell as bad, or it's not gonna be as hard to work with. Because rubber cement is so sticky, it's not going to do quite as detailed of work, but it's good for the, you know, your little moment here. But yeah, you have to think in the negative space, which is difficult. and you know, rubber cement doesn't also show up as easily. Like, you can barely tell I did that, but I did. So yeah. Ooh, look at all the cool stuff that the salt is doing. I love seeing it. It's just so fun to see it go and see it do things. Watch it go, watch it do things. All right. So I would love to hear a story, if you have one, about a favorite teacher. So while I'm waiting for this to dry, I want stories about teachers. The reason that I'm wearing this shirt here. This is my Educate shirt, and this is a poster that I made for going on a protest. Look at that. I was dressed as Miss Frizzle, which I often do because Miss Frizzle is awesome. And yeah. Just let's support education. So if you have a favorite teacher story, please let me know. Good old music that's free to use right now. This is, I thought, what can I play that's creative, like Creative Commons, like no license? And I'm like, well, classical music, I can do that. And since I'm like doing an education thing, might as well. All right. Let's see. What else? What other cool technique can I teach y'all? Well, while this is drying, I usually do the alcohol drops, which is really fun. I'll do some glazing. All right, for glazing, you want to do a wet color. So I'm going to dip, drop, and then pet the cat. All right. Alright, I'll just let that dry a little bit. So this is basic. When you're glazing, you're gonna be, you can do like a wet wash and then you glaze over it once that dries with a different color. So, anywho, any stories about your favorite teachers? Anybody? Anyone? All right, I'll share another education story. All right, so my first education story I told you was my first grade teacher. I'm gonna tell you about my favorite, one of my favorite teachers in middle school, and she was surprising because she taught math, and she was we'll call her Mrs. G. So Mrs. G was one of those teachers who cared so dang much. Again, I hated math so much. So I had a bad experience with a teacher in 4th grade, and I just really honestly could not do math at all. And so a big problem, here I'm going to pop this one while I'm doing that. So anyways, so in 4th grade I had, just this teacher that just kind of made me hate school, hate my life, really. It was a really, really rough year. And I still struggled with a lot of the things about education. It's probably because I have a little bit of dyslexia, although I was never fully diagnosed with it. Hey, Joe. We're sharing education stories here. I'm going to write that. So anyways, so my 8th grade math teacher recognized that I was scared of math, and I still am not very good with math. And I ended up learning so much through her, because she understood that I learned visually a lot more. So she helped me adapt what I needed to know for math in a more visual way, and sometimes that meant using things that were a little bit more childlike, but she would do it in a way that wouldn't make it so that I was singled out. So then I ended up doing, I was just doing poorly in math, and she just really took it upon herself to try and get me to pass that math class. I think it was actually 7th grade. And I remember her just going through all of these things, and I just was so hopeless. I felt hopeless about math. And she ended up taking time out of her day to teach me, because I wanted to learn. I just felt hopeless about it. And I ended up she taught me so much through for math. And I still struggle with math to this day. But I remember one thing specifically. She had this really big packet of projects, a packet of math work that we had to do for the end of the semester, and it was basically showing that we understood all of the different math techniques and formulas. And she wanted you to be more creative with it, so I poured my heart and soul into this, but I just didn't get it. And I remember her taking her time and trying to teach me, and I ended up not able to finish it. And it was the end of the semester, and she knew that if I didn't get it turned in, that I was not going to do well in her class. So what she did, which I wouldn't recommend to all my teacher friends, she actually gave my mom her address, and we drove to her house and dropped off my math assignment. That was her Saturday, so she could grade it so that I wouldn't fail that semester. And it was just teachers care so dang much, and there's always teachers out there that do these things that care a lot and will sacrifice whatever they can to make sure that you succeed. And those are 2 teachers that made a difference in the stuff that I was not confident in, because obviously I was confident in this. So, share your story if you want about education. All right. So glazing, you have one thing, it's dry. Okay, I'm gonna do orange. So the cool thing about watercolors is that you can reactivate your paint a little bit. So then you can see that it's like mixing colors there. Usually you want to do a little bit lighter. So then you can see it mixes all the colors together. It's kind of nice. Hello, Alpagene. I am asking people to share their favorite story of a teacher. If you have a favorite teacher story. And I am teaching different watercolor techniques. Alright, is that Frisket? So this is a comparison of Frisket and rubber cement. I'm gonna do this. So the nice thing about Frisket and rubber cement is it makes the watercolor kind of run away from those areas, so you can really see what's happening here. Most of your teachers were really nice. I'm glad to hear it. We've all had the bad teachers too. Like I mean, there's usually at least one or two teachers that are not your favorite. But alright, let's see what happened with the rubber cement. Alright, and I'm going to have to be more creative because I did not see where the rubber cement went to. And that's the dangers of rubber cement versus Frisket. You can see, like, the nice thing about Frisket is that it is usually toned a little bit yellow, so you can see it, as opposed to rubber cement, which is clear. And it's also, Frisket is a lot more liquidy, so you can have a lot more control. But it's still, like, if you don't want to spend money on Frisket and you have some rubber cement lying around, this is a terrible eye. Oh well. Alright, so then I'll let these dry before I remove the Frisket and the rubber cement. So make sure if you are using this technique that you let these dry. Oh, I forgot to turn this back on. Yeah, so with these, they both require a lot of drying time. So make sure you let the Frisket and the rubber cement dry before you put paint on it. And then also, once you're done painting it, let the paint dry before you end up putting the, taking it off. All right, Alpy Jean's teacher story. If I had to narrow it down to one, though, it would be my creative writing teacher from high school. She also ran the creative writing club and was all about getting people to share with the class, read aloud, and so on. I was deathly shy in high school, to the point I barely talked, and I'd nearly have anxiety attacks doing presentations. She managed to work with me to the point where I was able to actually read in front of the other students after a while. She's also the reason I actually wound up writing a whole sci-fi novel. She really encouraged me after we had a unit of writing a chapter of a fantasy story, and she insisted I email her the finished product. That's awesome. I'm so glad that you had that experience and that, like, there was somebody who believed in you. I think that's something that's really cool, to have, like, a person who believes in you and helps you get out of the comfort zone. Because that's, I think, the most important job of a teacher is to push, to get students to try new things and to have somebody that believes in them. So I'm really glad that you had that experience and that your creative writing teacher encouraged you to finish a novel, which, whew, that's hard to do. So congratulations on finishing a whole sci-fi novel too. That's awesome, because I haven't done that. Alrighty. Alright, we're just now on to some audio live-free music, so I'm just gonna let it play. Alright. Oh, that's so blurry. Your art teachers were sad, generally a different story. I'm sad about, but oh well, I guess it's in the past. I know. I had one bad art teacher, and one teacher that just didn't quite teach what I needed to. I luckily had probably the best experience for high school with teaching art. They were awesome. I should probably, like, adjust this. Sorry, I'm noticing that it's super blurry, so I'm gonna try and adjust that. I think that's better. All right. Joe's favorite teacher story. Joe says, I guess my favorite teacher story is the time my high school chem teacher, Mr. Jury, returned from a mysterious 2-week absence. He was an upbeat, kind of hippie-looking fellow that was always encouraging. When he got back, we learned that he was put on temporary leave because he was involved in an investigation of domestic violence following a particularly bad argument he had with his ex-wife. It was a very, very tumultuous divorce. When he got back, he explained that it didn't lean. That's scary. Yeah, you're like, how is this like really nice dude? Yeah, teachers, have lives. Huh. So anyway, yeah, it was a reminder to my often distracted and confused teenage self that a teacher isn't just a cog in the machine. And it was a reminder that has lasted me a lifetime since. Yeah, teachers have lives, and teachers struggle. The teacher struggle is real, guys. So I had an art teacher who at some point crumpled up a drawing in front of the class I was really proud of and went to show her all excited. Thankfully, it was the same year I had the creative writing teacher, so talking to her helped a lot. That's so sad. I hope, it's really tough because, as from the teacher side of things, I'm sure I've probably done something to a student that, they maybe don't like. I don't know. It could have happened. All right, we'll just keep on playing this music. But I hope that I encourage students. I definitely push students out of their comfort zone. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes kids don't necessarily like that. As an art teacher, I don't give unfocused praise. If there is something I'm not just going to walk by and say, I like it. I'm going to say, oh, I really like this specific thing that you like, that you did. Or I'll give suggestions of what to do to help you, because I'm a teacher. I think sometimes it really is tough, though, because not everybody wants to be an artist. And I personally, growing up, always wanted critique. I always wanted to improve. But not everybody in my classroom wants to always improve. They just want to get an A. And I do respect that. But I hope that people will, be okay with whatever I say. So, all right. I know it's really hard to see back down here, but I'm going to draw a crayon resist drawing. So these are super cheapo crayons, so I don't know how well they'll work. I don't know if I have my oil pastels. Oil pastel also works really nicely for a crayon resist technique. I do a wet wash. I wouldn't have been as upset if she just critiqued the piece instead of being that harsh. Yeah, I understand that I was still learning and it definitely wasn't the best thing I'd ever, but that seemed a little over the top. Absolutely, no teacher should ever crumple up your artwork. That's so disrespectful. I mean, she was probably having a rough day, but yeah, you never do that to a kid. Yeah, way to crush their hopes and dreams. And it is scary because as an artist and as an art teacher, there's some people that art is something that's subjective. And so a lot of times people get really scared. This is the of sharing their art, or they just think that they're not good enough. All right, a better art teacher story though. I went to take watercolor painting class outside of school and found out that when I got to the class, the teacher was actually the mother of a friend of mine from kindergarten and first grade that I had actually lost touch with. I'm gonna do some gradient too. All right, these things are dry, so the best thing about Frisket is peeling it, in my opinion. It's so satisfying. Oh my goodness. Look at that bright white. All right, and then the rubber cement, not as good. It's almost like the thing that's intended to be used as a art tool is better. All right. That's better. Oops. Oh yeah, sponge. I'll do sponge here too. We'll just do this. Sponge. I have a natural sponge here, which is really nice. Oh, more snow shoveling. Oh, fun. I have a nice day today. I would like some more snow. I wouldn't mind a snow day. Alright, I gotta go change my water. See, when your water gets like this, you kinda need to go change your water. Alright, I'll be right back. So my last two things I'm gonna do, and then I'll call it good for this one. I'll probably end up doing another stream later tonight. Maybe if I end up choosing to. I don't know. If I get done with all my other stuff that I have to do. Where I'm actually gonna do the art I really want to do. But this, I was wanting to do like an educational thing. And that's probably what I'm gonna do Sunday mornings, is do like a little educational channel bit. So come join me Sundays for some edumacation. All right, So a hard versus soft edge. So the nice thing about watercolors, if you do a dry brush or a dry paper and wet paint, is you can get a really nice clean edge. And that means you can do some shading. Oh, you can also do some lifting. So you take like a little bit of paper towel, you can lift up. And that can create something that's a little bit more shaded. Has a little bit more form to it. And then if you wanted to create a more soft edge, so like say you want to do the shadow here, okay, so that's still a hard edge. But then if you take a wet brush, you can actually blend it out and sort of soften that look. So that's a cool technique. All right, let's go ahead and do our sponge. All right, for a sponge, you wanna, there's a couple things you'll wanna do. You wanna bring some colors over to your palette. And you can either get your sponge a little bit wet too. Or you can get like some darker colors, like directly. And the nice thing is too, with like a sponge, especially if you have like a natural sponge, it creates a lot of nice natural texture, which is really great for foliage. So that's sponge. To do more dry brush, because I didn't like the way that dry brush looked. Usually it's nice when you're using paint that's like from the tube, because then it's already like liquidy. It's much easier to do like the dry brush technique using that. Oh yeah, it's up here. Because you do really need it to be just beyond liquid. You do little scrapings. All right. So that is, I think, all I'm gonna do for right now. So yeah, This is some different techniques. So just to review, you can do a wet wash. That's using, put wet water down, and then you put wet paint down, and you can get a nice soft gradient without getting the brush texture in. You can do a wet on wet technique where you do that gradient, and then you drop bits of wet paint of a different color in to get kind of this kind of snowflakey look. Oh, the salt technique, you have to let this dry before you brush off your salt. Okay, always let it dry. But yeah, so that's the salt technique. So it kind of creates this really interesting texture. Again, kind of good for like snowflakes. It's good for texture inside of like an ocean color. So it's a really nice technique. Dry brush, recommended to use not necessarily the cheapo paint palettes, but instead using your like more tube paints. But this works well enough. Glazing, you do a wet paint down first, let it dry, and then you can glaze over it with a different color. Frisket, you lay down liquid frisket or rubber cement, let it dry, and then you can paint over it, and you will end up still leaving a nice bright white, which can be really convenient if you don't want to painstakingly paint around white objects. Crayon resist, you draw with crayon. I like to draw with white crayon because you get an interesting texture, and you can draw some really cool textures in there and get that nice thing. When you're using a hard versus soft edge, you paint on dry paper. You can get a really nice hard edge on your watercolor, but then if you just bring out your edges using some water, you can create a nice soft texture. And then sponging, you just use either a natural or just a regular sponge that you cut up, and you can create a really interesting texture that's good for foliage. So that's all for right now. I hope that you will all go thank a teacher, because teachers work hard. And there's always like those teachers that mean a lot to you, who you remember. Like if you can track them down and send them an email about like what like a difference they made in your life, it means so dang much. So please, if you can, do that, because it's good. It's good to do. So if you can do that, please do, because it's nice. And everybody deserves some thanks and appreciation. So yeah, go thank a teacher if you can. And I might pop on later tonight to do some of my own painting, but hopefully you found this educational. And yeah, thanks for hanging out. Toodles.